The southern sun crawled across the sky over Millfield, casting long shadows that danced between the old brick buildings downtown. The heat pressed down like a physical weight, making the air shimmer above the pavement that had absorbed decades of history beneath its cracked surface. This was where it would all begin again. Charles Montgomery Winthrop adjusted his tie and felt a single bead of sweat trace the curve of his temple, gravity pulling it along the deep lines etched by 73 years of life. His reflection in the polished brass plaque beside the revolving door showed a man wearing dignity like others wore expensive cologne, subtle but unmistakable. He straightened his shoulders, feeling the weight of his purpose settle alongside the familiar ache in his lower back. "Not today," he whispered to the ghost of pain that had accompanied him since his days loading cotton at the mill that had once dominated this town's economy and skyline. "We've got work to do." The revolving door spun with practiced ease, welcoming him into a blast of artificial cold that raised goosebumps along his arms. The contrast between outside and in mimicked the journey of his life, from the heat and dust of physical labor to the cool, calculated world of business and investment. The marble-floored lobby gleamed under recessed lighting, so different from how he remembered this building from his childhood. Back then, these same floors had been worn wooden planks, treaded by generations of black families coming to learn, to gather, to find community when the rest of the town had offered none. The young receptionist glanced up with the practiced smile of someone paid to be pleasant to strangers. Her fingers continued tapping at her keyboard, the rhythm barely interrupted by his arrival. "Good morning," Charles said, his voice carrying the gentle rasp of age but none of its weakness. "Beautiful building you have here." "Thank you, sir." Her eyes flickered to his weathered face, then down to his hands that told the story of a life lived working. "Can I help you with something today? I'm curious about the history of this place," he said, leaning slightly against the sleek granite counter. "It's been many things over the years, hasn't it?" A flicker of confusion crossed her face. "I wouldn't know, sir. I've only worked here 6 months." She glanced toward the security desk where a younger man sat watching a bank of monitors. "Tim might know more. He's been here longer." Tim looked up at the mention of his name, appraising Charles with the quick calculation of someone tasked with identifying potential problems. "Can I help you, sir?" "Just wondering about the building's history," Charles repeated, offering a smile that creased the corners of his eyes. "I remember when it was quite different." The security guard exchanged a glance with the receptionist, a silent communication that Charles recognized all too well, the look that said, "Just another old man with nothing better to do than reminisce." "Pretty sure it was a hotel or something before the renovation," Tim said, his tone suggesting the conversation had already reached its natural conclusion. "Nothing special." From the far side of the lobby, a sharp laugh cut through the air-conditioned quiet. A woman in a tailored suit didn't bother lowering her voice as she leaned toward her colleague. "Another history buff, looking for the good old days. We get one every couple of months." "Probably thinking of the Carter Hotel from the 60s, her colleague replied, loud enough to be heard. "Used to be a Fleabag motel before Barrett Development bought the whole block." Charles felt the familiar weight settle in his chest. Not anger, but a resigned acknowledgement of being dismissed, rendered invisible by assumptions. He'd felt it when applying for his first bank loan, during job interviews where his qualifications were questioned, despite impeccable credentials, at school meetings for his children where teachers spoke over him. "Actually," he said, his voice remaining steady, "I was thinking of when it was the Millfield Community Education Center before that. My father taught night classes here for adults who wanted to learn to read. That would have been the 1950s through 68. The silence that followed carried its own weight. The woman who had laughed looked down suddenly, finding something fascinating in her coffee cup. "I didn't know that," the receptionist finally said, her voice smaller now. "Most don't," Charles replied, straightening his tie again. "History has a way of being forgotten when it's inconvenient to remember. Thank you for your time." He turned toward the executive elevator, pressed the button for the 3rd floor, and entered without looking back at their surprised expressions. He didn't need their permission or their recognition, not anymore. The weight of the property portfolio in his briefcase was validation enough. If you're joining me on this journey through time and justice, take a moment to hit the subscribe button. Stories like Charles's deserve to be heard, and your support helps make that possible. The law offices of Barrett, Williams, and Schmidt occupied the entire 3rd floor, their name etched in gold lettering on frosted glass doors. The reception area was tastefully decorated with generic watercolor landscapes that said nothing while trying to appear sophisticated. Charles approached the desk where a young woman with tight blonde curls sat organizing files. "Good morning," he said. "I have an appointment with Mr. Ellis regarding the Millfield Historical District property acquisition." Her smile was genuine, a refreshing change. "Mr. Winthrop, yes, of course, Mr. Ellis is expecting you. Would you like some coffee while you wait? He's just finishing up a call." "That would be lovely, thank you. Black, please." She nodded and disappeared into a side room. Charles settled into one of the leather armchairs, feeling its expensive give beneath him. He remembered when sitting in places like this required permission, when doors like these remained firmly closed to people who looked like him. The coffee arrived in a proper ceramic mug, not disposable, another small courtesy, he noted. As he took his first sip, a tall man with silver temples and the confident stride of someone comfortable with power emerged from an inner office. "Mr. Winthrop Bradley Ellis." He extended his hand, his grip firm but not challenging. "Sorry to keep you waiting. Please come in." Ellis's office offered a sweeping view of downtown Millfield, the old and new buildings creating a patchwork of architectural styles. Behind his desk hung framed degrees from prestigious universities and photographs of Ellis shaking hands with various politicians. "Beautiful view," Charles observed, taking the seat Ellis offered. "One of the perks of the corner office," Ellis agreed, settling behind his desk. "Now I understand you're interested in several properties in the historical district. I have to tell you, that area's heating up. Barrett Development has been acquiring parcels for their Millfield Renaissance project." Charles nodded, sipping his coffee. "So I've heard, particularly the old Millfield Community Building. The Madison Tower?" "Yes. Prime location. Barrett has made an offer, but there are still some contingencies to work through. Between us, they're looking to transform it into a luxury hotel and spa. Quite a vision they have." Charles set his cup down carefully. "I have a different vision, Mr. Ellis." For the next 20 minutes, Charles outlined his interest not just in the Madison Tower, the building that had once housed the community center, but in 3 adjacent properties. He spoke of market trends, of development potential, of return on investment. He used the language of business, not sentiment, watching Ellis's expression shift from polite interest to genuine engagement. "That's quite ambitious, Mr. Winthrop. You're talking about a significant investment. May I ask about your financing?" Charles removed a folder from his briefcase, sliding it across the polished mahogany desk. "My complete financial portfolio, letters from my banks and references from previous development projects in Atlanta, Charlotte, and Birmingham." Ellis's eyebrows rose slightly as he scanned the documents. "Winthrop Community Development Corporation. I wasn't familiar." "We've kept a low profile," Charles said simply, "but our track record speaks for itself." "Indeed it does." Ellis closed the folder, studying Charles with new eyes. "May I be frank, Mr. Winthrop? Barrett Development has significant political connections in Millfield. They've been wining and dining the city council for months. The mayor's already spoken publicly about his enthusiasm for their project. Politics change, Mr. Ellis. Community needs don't." Charles leaned forward slightly. "I'd like to make an offer on all 4 properties, contingent on inspection and title verification. I can have the paperwork ready by tomorrow." Ellis drummed his fingers on the desk. "I'll present your offer, but I should warn you, Barrett plays hardball. They're not used to competition in Millfield." "Neither am I, Mr. Ellis." Charles stood, extending his hand. "But I believe that's about to change." As he left the office, Charles felt the familiar flutter of doubt in his stomach, the kind that had appeared before every major decision in his life. When he'd left Millfield at 18 with nothing but $42 and a bus ticket to Atlanta. When he'd applied for his first business loan. When he decided to return home after 50 years away. But alongside that doubt stood the conviction that had carried him through decades of closed doors and subtle slights, the certainty that some fights were worth having, regardless of outcome. The autumn air felt different now, charged with possibility as he made his way down Center Street. The old oak trees lining the sidewalk had dropped their first offerings of the season, golden brown leaves that crunched beneath his polished shoes. He paused outside the Madison Tower, looking up at its red brick facade and ornate cornices. The ghost of his father seemed to stand beside him, pointing out the second-floor windows where he'd taught his night classes, where Charles himself had first learned the power of education to transform lives. "We might be coming home, Pop," he whispered to the memory. Have you ever returned to a place from your past only to find it completely changed? Share your experience in the comments below. I'd love to hear how you reconciled your memories with the new reality. 3 days later, Charles sat at a corner table in Millfield's oldest cafe, the Daily Grind. The place had been a fixture downtown since the 1930s, changing hands but never purpose. The current owner, Mabel Jenkins, was the granddaughter of the original proprietor, a woman who'd maintained not just the vintage decor, but the cafe's legacy as the beating heart of local gossip and community news. The bell above the door jingled, and Charles looked up to see Sofia Rodriguez enter, scanning the cafe until she spotted him. At 32, Sofia was the youngest staff attorney at Barrett, Williams and Schmidt, a fact she'd mentioned with pride when she'd called him that morning requesting this meeting. "Mr. Winthrop," she said, extending her hand as she approached his table. "Thank you for agreeing to meet on such short notice." "Ms. Rodriguez," he replied, rising briefly to shake her hand. "Please join me. Coffee?" "That would be wonderful, thank you." He signaled to the waitress, who nodded with the familiarity of someone who'd been serving him daily since his return to Millfield. When Sofia's coffee arrived, she wrapped her hands around the mug, as if seeking its warmth despite the mild day. "I hope you don't find this inappropriate," she began, her voice lowered. "Mr. Ellis doesn't know I've contacted you." Charles raised an eyebrow but said nothing, giving her space to continue. "Your offer on the Madison Tower and the adjacent properties, it was presented to the owners yesterday." She hesitated, glancing around before continuing. "Barrett Development has countered with an offer 20% above asking price." "I see," Charles said, keeping his expression neutral despite the sinking feeling in his stomach. "And you're telling me this because they didn't just increase their offer after hearing about yours, they've also fast-tracked the zoning change application for the entire block." Sofia pulled a folded paper from her purse, sliding it across the table. "This was submitted to the Planning Commission yesterday afternoon. They're requesting a special meeting next week to approve it." Charles unfolded the document, scanning its contents. "Mixed-use luxury development, minimum income requirements for residential units, private membership for amenities." He looked up. "Why are you showing me this, Ms. Rodriguez?" Sofia's gaze was steady now, her initial nervousness replaced with resolve. "My parents emigrated from Mexico when I was 3. My father worked construction, including the renovation of the Madison Tower in the 90s. He used to tell me stories about what that building meant to the black community here, how it had been a place of learning, of gathering, when other doors were closed." She took a sip of her coffee before continuing. "Barrett's development plan would price out most of the families who've lived in that neighborhood for generations. The community spaces they're promising would be token gestures, not real resources. That's often how progress works in places like Millfield," Charles said, his voice carrying no bitterness, just the weight of observed truth. "It doesn't have to be." Sofia withdrew another document from her purse. "The Planning Commission requires historical impact studies for any development in buildings over 50 years old. Barrett's claiming exemption because of the 1990s renovation. But I found this." The yellowed newspaper clipping showed the Madison Tower circa 1965, a crowd gathered on its steps for what appeared to be a community celebration. The caption read, "Millfield Community Education Center celebrates 100% adult literacy program completion, first of its kind in the state." Charles felt his throat tighten at the image. In the front row, barely visible, stood his father in his Sunday best, pride evident even in the grainy black and white photograph. "Where did you find this?" he asked quietly. "County Archives. I've been doing some research in my spare time. There's more: board minutes, program records, attendance logs, enough to make a case for historical designation that would complicate Barrett's plans significantly." Charles studied her face, looking for the hidden angle, the secret motivation. "Why would you risk your position at the firm to share this with me?" Sofia's smile held a hint of sadness. "Maybe because I believe some buildings are more than just real estate investments, or maybe because my father always told me to recognize which side of history I want to stand on." She stood, leaving her coffee half finished. "The Planning Commission meets Monday at 4 p.m. Historical designation requests can be submitted by any citizen with documentation. Just something to consider, Mr. Winthrop." After she left, Charles remained at the table long after his coffee had gone cold, memories washing over him like waves. The Madison Tower had been more than a building. It had been a revolution disguised as architecture, a declaration that education and community belonged to everyone. His father had taught reading there for 15 years, refusing payment, insisting that knowledge was meant to be shared, not sold. The newspaper clipping seemed to burn in his pocket as he finally left the cafe, autumn sunlight streaming through the oak trees as he walked the familiar path back to his hotel. The doubt that had flickered earlier now burned brighter. Barratt Development had resources he couldn't match, connections he didn't possess. Fighting them would mean potential financial loss, possible humiliation. But as he passed the Madison Tower again, he noticed something he'd missed before, a faded outline on the bricks near the entrance where a plaque had once hung. He knew without seeing it what those words had proclaimed: "Knowledge builds bridges where roads end," his father's favorite saying, the motto of the community center that had changed countless lives. Sometimes the hardest part isn't standing up for what's right. It's believing you're the right person to do the standing. If this resonates with you, take a second to subscribe to our channel for more stories of courage and conviction. The Millfield City Planning Commission met in a wood-paneled chamber that smelled of furniture polish and old paper. Charles arrived 30 minutes early, taking a seat in the back row, his portfolio case resting on his knees. The room gradually filled with men and women in business attire, representatives from Barratt Development, he assumed, along with a smattering of curious citizens. At precisely 4 p.m., Commissioner Helen Walters called the meeting to order, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun that matched her no-nonsense expression. First on our agenda, the expedited zoning request for the Madison Tower and adjacent properties presented by Barratt Development. A polished man in his 40s approached the podium, armed with a sleek presentation and practiced charm. "Thank you, Commissioner Walters, esteemed board members. I'm Richard Barratt, CEO of Barratt Development. We're excited to present our vision for the Millfield Renaissance Project, a transformative development that will revitalize downtown and create over 200 jobs." The digital presentation flashed images of gleaming buildings, roof gardens, and happy people strolling through manicured public spaces. Barratt narrated with the confidence of someone used to getting his way, emphasizing economic benefits, tax revenue, and Millfield's entry into the 21st century. The centerpiece of this development will be the Madison Grand Hotel and Spa, converting the underutilized office building at 412 Center Street into a luxury destination that will put Millfield on the map. Barratt clicked to an architectural rendering that bore little resemblance to the current building, its historic facade replaced with glass and steel. Commissioner Walters nodded along, occasionally making notes. When Barratt finished, she looked up. "Thank you, Mr. Barratt. Are there any questions from the commission?" An older gentleman at the end of the table cleared his throat. "What consideration has been given to the historical significance of these buildings, particularly the Madison Tower?" Barratt smiled smoothly. "Excellent question, Commissioner Jackson. As our filing indicates, the Madison Tower underwent significant renovation in 1992, effectively removing any historical designation eligibility. We've included the architect's assessment confirming this." Charles felt his pulse quicken. This was the moment. His hands tightened around his portfolio as he considered remaining silent, avoiding conflict, preserving his dignity by not risking rejection. But somewhere in his mind, his father's voice echoed, "A man who stands for nothing will accept anything." Commissioner Walters was about to move on when Charles rose to his feet. "Madam Commissioner, if I may." All heads turned toward him, curiosity and annoyance mingling in their expressions. "The public comment period is after the vote, sir," Walters said, her tone polite but firm. "I believe I have relevant information regarding the historical status of the property in question," Charles replied, keeping his voice steady. "Information that should be considered before a vote." A murmur rippled through the room. Richard Barratt's practiced smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Commissioner Jackson leaned forward. "I move we hear the gentleman's information, given its potential relevance to our decision." Walters hesitated, then nodded. "Please approach the podium and state your name for the record." Charles walked forward, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. His heart pounded against his ribs, but his steps remained measured, deliberate. At the podium, he removed his documentation from the portfolio, arranging it carefully before looking up. "My name is Charles Montgomery Winthrop. I was born in Millfield in 1952, in the neighborhood now being discussed for redevelopment." He gestured to the Madison Tower on Barratt's rendering, That building was the Millfield Community Education Center from 1947 until 1969, when economic pressures forced its closure. It was one of the only places in this town where black citizens could gather freely for education and community events during segregation. He placed the newspaper clipping on the document projector, and the image of the literacy program celebration appeared on the screen behind him, replacing Barrett's sleek rendering. My father, William Winthrop, taught literacy classes there for 15 years. Over 1,000 adults learned to read and write within those walls, at a time when traditional educational pathways were closed to them. Charles produced more documents, faded attendance records, program curricula, letters from community members whose lives had been changed by the center. These records established the Madison Tower as a site of significant cultural and historical importance to this community. The 1992 renovation changed the interior, but preserved the structural and architectural elements that define its historical character. He turned to face Richard Barrett directly. The historical significance of a building isn't erased by new carpet and paint, Mr. Barrett. It lives in the purpose it served and the lives it transformed. Barrett's expression had hardened now, his earlier charm evaporating. This is highly irregular, Commissioner Walters. Mr. Winthrop has no standing to present this information, and it contradicts the professional assessment we've submitted. On the contrary, came a voice from the back of the room. Sophia Rodriguez stood, a thick folder in her hands. I have here the complete historical record of the Madison Tower, compiled from county archives, including its original designation application from 1972, which was never processed due to administrative oversight. Mr. Winthrop is well within his rights to present this information. Commissioner Walters removed her glasses, pinching the bridge of her nose. It seems we have conflicting information that requires review. I move that we table the zoning decision until our next regular meeting, giving staff time to evaluate these historical claims. Second, Commissioner Jackson said immediately. All in favor? Walters asked, looking around the table. 5 hands raised, with 2 commissioners abstaining. Motion carries. This matter is tabled for 30 days. Walters banged her gavel, ignoring Richard Barrett's barely contained frustration. As the meeting moved to other agenda items, Charles gathered his documents, his hands trembling slightly with released tension. Outside in the corridor, he found Sophia waiting. That was quite a presentation, Mr. Winthrop, she said, her expression both impressed and concerned. Barrett won't take this lightly. I didn't expect him to, Charles replied, securing his portfolio. Thank you for your support in there. I just provided facts, she said with a small smile. You provided the heart, but this is just the beginning. Barrett Development has considerable influence in this town. They'll fight the historical designation with everything they have. Charles nodded, the weight of the challenge ahead settling on his shoulders. Then we'll need to be prepared. Are you sure you want to be involved, Ms. Rodriguez? Your career could suffer. Some things matter more than career advancement, she replied simply. My father taught me that. Besides, I've been offered a position with a public interest law firm in Atlanta. I was already planning my exit strategy. As they walked out into the fading afternoon light, Charles found himself studying the younger woman with newfound respect. Her courage reminded him of his own daughter, who had inherited his stubborn streak and sense of justice. We should probably discuss strategy then. Are you free for dinner? Lead the way, Mr. Winthrop. Has there been a moment in your life where you had to choose between staying silent or speaking up for something important? What gave you the courage to make that choice? I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. The following morning, Charles awoke to his ringing phone. The bedside clock in his hotel room read 6:17 a.m. Hello? He answered, voice still rough with sleep. Mr. Winthrop? It's Bradley Ellis. The lawyer's voice sounded strained. I apologize for the early call, but there's been a development you should know about immediately. Charles sat up, instantly alert. What's happened? Barrett Development has submitted a cash offer for all 4 properties. 25% above asking price, no contingencies, closing in 10 days. Ellis paused. The owners are inclined to accept. The floor seemed to drop away beneath Charles. 25% above market value was millions more than his offer, far beyond what he could reasonably counter. I see. Thank you for letting me know. There's more, Ellis continued. The Millfield Herald is running a story this morning questioning the legitimacy of the historical documentation presented yesterday. They're citing anonymous sources, claiming the records were fabricated or misrepresented. Charles felt a cold anger settle in his chest. That's absurd. Those documents came directly from county archives. I know that and you know that, Ellis said carefully, but public perception is already being shaped. Richard Barrett is well connected with local media. After hanging up, Charles stood at the window of his hotel room, watching the sun rise over Millfield. The town's church spires and water tower were silhouetted against the pale orange sky, a view that had changed little since his childhood. But the community beneath those familiar outlines had transformed repeatedly, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. His reflection in the glass showed a man at a crossroads. The practical path was clear: withdraw his offer, save his pride, return to Atlanta where his business was established and respected. Fighting Barrett would mean public scrutiny, potential embarrassment, and significant financial loss if he continued pursuing a property he'd likely never acquire. The buzz of his phone interrupted his thoughts. A text message from an unknown number read, "Channel 5 running story on controversial development at noon. They're looking for comment from both sides. Sophia." Charles closed his eyes briefly, then made his decision. He dialed his financial advisor in Atlanta. "Martin, it's Charles Winthrop. I need to liquidate some assets." "Yes, I understand the tax implications." "No, it can't wait until after the quarter. I need the funds available by end of day." By noon, Charles sat in the Millfield Channel 5 news studio, makeup applied to his face for the first time in his life, a microphone clipped to his tie. Across from him, Richard Barrett looked completely at ease, his camera-ready smile reflecting years of media training. The reporter, a woman in her 40s with professionally highlighted hair, addressed the camera. "Today we're discussing the proposed redevelopment of the Madison Tower and surrounding properties, which has become unexpectedly controversial after historical preservation claims emerged at yesterday's Planning Commission meeting. Joining us are Richard Barrett of Barrett Development and Charles Winthrop, who raised the historical concerns." She turned to Richard first. "Mr. Barrett, your company has proposed a multi-million-dollar development project that would transform downtown Millfield. Can you tell us about your vision?" Barrett leaned forward earnestly. "Absolutely, Diane. The Millfield Renaissance Project represents a once-in-a-generation opportunity to revitalize our downtown, create hundreds of jobs, and bring modern amenities to our community. We're talking about luxury accommodations, fine dining, boutique retail, all while preserving the architectural character that makes Millfield special." "And what about the historical claims regarding the Madison Tower specifically?" Diane asked. Barrett's smile never faltered. "We respect Millfield's rich history deeply. That's why we've had professional preservationists and architects evaluate the building thoroughly. While the Madison Tower has had many uses over the years, the substantial renovations in the 1990s removed any elements that would qualify it for historical protection. The documentation presented yesterday was interesting, but ultimately not relevant to the building's current status." Diane nodded, turning to Charles. "Mr. Winthrop, you claim the Madison Tower has historical significance that should prevent its redevelopment. Could you explain?" Charles felt the heat of the studio lights, aware of how this moment would be perceived. An elderly black man challenging a prominent white businessman, the kind of confrontation that could easily be dismissed as bitterness or entitlement rather than legitimate concern. He took a deep breath, remembering his father's counsel to always speak from knowledge, not emotion. "The Madison Tower was the Millfield Community Education Center from 1947 to 1969, he began, his voice steady. "During segregation, it was one of the only places where black citizens could gather freely for education and community events. Over 1,000 adults learned to read and write there. Countless community leaders, business owners, and educators got their start within those walls." He removed a photograph from his jacket pocket, holding it toward the camera. "This is my father, William Winthrop, who taught literacy classes there for 15 years without pay. The building's significance isn't just in its architecture, but in its purpose, a place that provided opportunity when most doors were closed." "That's certainly moving," Diane said, her professional neutrality firmly in place. "But Mr. Barrett's team says the building no longer qualifies for historical protection due to renovations." "Interior renovations don't erase history," Charles replied. "The structure, the facade, and most importantly, the cultural significance remain intact. That's why I've submitted a formal application for historical designation with the State Preservation Office, including over 100 personal testimonials from community members whose lives were changed by programs at the center. Barrett's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. While these stories are certainly touching, business decisions need to be based on facts, not nostalgia. The fact is, Barrett Development has made a generous offer on these properties that will benefit the current owners and the entire community through tax revenue and economic growth. Speaking of offers, Diane interjected, there are reports that you, Mr. Winthrop, have also made an offer on these properties. Is that correct? And if so, what are your plans? Charles nodded. Yes, through my company, Winthrop Community Development Corporation. Our vision is to restore the Madison Tower to its original purpose, a community education and resource center with affordable housing in the adjacent properties, small business incubation spaces and intergenerational mentoring programs. And how would this be funded? Diane asked, skepticism evident in her tone. The same way all development is funded, through investment capital, loans and operational revenue, Charles replied calmly. The difference is in how returns are measured. We define success not just by financial profit, but by community impact. Barrett chuckled, the sound carefully calibrated to convey amused disbelief rather than outright dismissal. While admirable, such projects typically require substantial public subsidies and rarely achieve financial sustainability. Millfield deserves a development that will stand on its own economically. As the segment concluded, Charles knew he'd held his own, but hadn't won any decisive victory. Public opinion would be divided, with many viewers simply seeing what their preconceptions prepared them to see, either a principled stand for preservation or an obstructionist blocking progress. Outside the studio, Richard Barrett approached, extending his hand with camera-ready cordiality. Passionate performance, Mr. Winthrop. I respect your commitment, misguided though it may be. Charles accepted the handshake, meeting Barrett's gaze directly. It's not a performance, Mr. Barrett. It's a promise I made long ago. Barrett's smile never reached his eyes. Well, promises are nice, but business is business. My offer is signed and funded. Sometimes the past needs to make way for the future. As Barrett walked away, Charles felt a moment of doubt so profound it nearly buckled his knees. What was he doing at 73, fighting battles that younger men with more resources would find challenging? Was this pride, stubbornness, or something more fundamental, a debt to those who had come before, whose sacrifices had made his own success possible? This story touches on the power of remembering where we came from, even as we build toward the future. If that resonates with you, please take a moment to like and subscribe. It helps ensure these stories of dignity and perseverance continue to be told. 3 days later, Charles sat alone in his hotel room, spreadsheets and financial projections scattered across the bed. He'd increased his offer twice, leveraging assets he'd intended to keep as security for his retirement. Each time, Barrett Development had countered within hours, always staying just ahead. The property owners, sensing a bidding war, had delayed their decision, but Charles knew his resources were finite while Barrett's seemed limitless. His phone rang, Sofia Rodriguez calling. Mr. Winthrop, I have news, she said, her voice tight with controlled emotion. The historical designation application has been fast-tracked for preliminary review, but Barrett's team has filed a challenge. They've submitted architectural assessments claiming that less than 25% of the original structure remains intact after the 1990s renovation, which would disqualify it from protection. Charles closed his eyes briefly. Is that true? It's complicated, Sophia admitted. The exterior is largely original, but the interior was substantially reconfigured. They're exploiting a technical loophole in the preservation statute. So we've lost that angle, Charles said, the weight of defeat pressing on his chest. Not necessarily. The State Preservation Office is sending an inspector tomorrow. If we can provide compelling evidence of the building's cultural significance, they might make an exception. Sophia paused. But there's something else. Barrett Development has scheduled a press conference for tomorrow afternoon to announce the successful acquisition of all 4 properties. Charles felt as if all the air had been sucked from the room. They've closed the deal. Not yet, Sophia clarified, but they're confident enough to announce it, which suggests they've either secured financing for an offer the owners can't refuse, or they've found another way to ensure my offer is rejected. Charles finished grimly. After hanging up, Charles stood at the window again, watching twilight settle over Millfield. In the distance, the Madison Tower stood silhouetted against the darkening sky. Its red brick facade turned purple in the fading light. For a moment, he could almost see it as it had been in his youth, windows glowing with light as adults gathered after work, determined to learn, to grow, to claim the education that had been systematically denied them. His father's voice seemed to whisper from those memories. Education isn't just about reading words, son. It's about reading the world around you, seeing what others miss, understanding what others deny. Charles turned back to the financial spreadsheets, reality intruding on memory. The numbers were unforgiving. He had reached the limit of what he could responsibly offer, already risking more than was prudent for a man his age. Barrett Development's resources dwarfed his own, their connections reaching into every corner of Millfield's power structure. For the first time since returning to his hometown, Charles considered surrender. Not just withdrawal from this battle, but acknowledgement that some systems were too entrenched to change, some wounds too deep to heal, some histories too inconvenient to preserve. He began packing his documents, each paper representing hours of research, hope, and determination. As he slid them into his portfolio, a small news clipping fell to the floor. Not one of the historical documents, but a more recent article about Barrett Development's previous projects. He'd barely glanced at it before, focused as he was on the Madison Tower's history rather than Barrett's. Now something caught his eye, a quote from a community activist in Charlotte, criticizing Barrett's pattern of promising affordable housing components that mysteriously disappeared from final plans after approvals were secured. Charles quickly searched online for more information, finding similar stories from 3 other cities where Barrett had developed properties. A pattern emerged: initial proposals featuring community benefits, zoning approvals granted based on those promises, then economic necessities requiring changes that eliminated the very elements that had won community support. In each case, by the time the bait and switch became apparent, construction was underway and officials were unwilling to halt progress. Charles reached for his phone, dialing Sophia's number. "I need everything you can find on Barrett Development's previous projects, particularly cases where initial proposals were modified after approvals. And I need to know who sits on Millfield's Historical Commission, City Council, and Planning Board, especially any overlapping memberships." "You've found something," Sophia stated rather than asked, her voice quickening with interest. "Maybe. Or maybe just a desperate man grasping at straws." Charles paused. "Either way, I'm not ready to concede defeat." By midnight, Charles and Sophia sat in a 24-hour diner on the outskirts of town, documents spread across the laminate table, coffee growing cold as they connected dots between Barrett Development's pattern of modified projects and the overlapping membership of Millfield's various boards and commissions. 3 members of the Planning Commission also sit on the Economic Development Board, Sophia noted, highlighting names on her printout. "And this one, Harold Jenkins, his architectural firm has designed 2 previous Barrett projects in other cities." Charles nodded. "And Commissioner Walter's husband is Senior Vice President at Millfield National Bank, which appears to be Barrett's primary lender for this project." He tapped another document. "What about the Historical Commission members?" "Less direct connection," Sophia admitted, flipping pages. "But they're appointed by the mayor, who received substantial campaign contributions from guess who? Barrett," Charles confirmed. "It's not illegal, but it certainly creates an ecosystem where challenging Barrett becomes difficult." The waitress refilled their coffee cups, eyeing their scattered papers with curiosity. As she walked away, Sophia leaned forward, lowering her voice. "This is all circumstantial, Mr. Winthrop. Concerning, yes, but not enough to stop the project." Charles sighed, rubbing his tired eyes. "I know, but it might be enough to raise questions, slow things down. Barrett's counting on speed and momentum. If we can disrupt that, create space for more voices to be heard." Sophia's phone buzzed with a text message. Her expression changed as she read it. "That's interesting. A colleague at the firm says Barrett's holding an emergency meeting with his investors tomorrow morning before the press conference. Apparently there's concern about unexpected complications." Charles felt a glimmer of hope. "We need to be at that press conference tomorrow, and I need to make one more call tonight." Back in his hotel room, Charles placed a call to Martin Chen, his banker in Atlanta. Martin, I need to know if our offer on the Millfield properties can be restructured. Not higher, but different. He explained his idea, listening as Martin walked through the financial implications. It's unorthodox, Martin concluded, but technically feasible. I can have the paperwork ready by 10 a.m. Are you sure about this, Charles? It's a significant risk. No, Charles admitted. I'm not sure at all, but some risks are worth taking. After hanging up, Charles finally allowed exhaustion to claim him, falling into bed fully clothed. As sleep approached, memories flickered through his mind. His father teaching a group of adults gathered around a scarred wooden table, pointing to letters and words with infinite patience. Himself as a child, watching from the doorway, understanding even then that something sacred was happening in that room. I'm trying, Pop, he whispered to the darkness. I'm really trying. Have you ever had to take a major risk to stand up for something you believed in? What gave you the strength to move forward despite the uncertainty? Share your experience in the comments. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Barratt Development's press conference was scheduled for 2 p.m. at the Millfield Grand Hotel. By 1:30, the ballroom was filled with local media, business leaders, and curious citizens drawn by rumors of a major announcement affecting downtown's future. A banner featuring the Barratt Development logo and Millfield Renaissance Project hung behind the podium. Charles arrived precisely at 1:45, dressed in his best suit, the one he reserved for board meetings and special occasions. Sophia met him at the entrance, her expression tense. "Barratt's running late," she whispered, as they found seats near the back. "The morning investor meeting apparently went longer than expected." Charles nodded, clutching his portfolio tightly. Inside were documents representing his last best hope, a restructured offer that Martin had finalized just hours earlier. "Any word from the State Preservation Office?" "Their inspector toured the building this morning," Sophia confirmed. "No decision yet, but she seemed impressed by the documentation we provided." At 2:15, Richard Barratt finally strode to the podium, his signature confidence seemingly intact despite the delay. Behind him stood several men in expensive suits, investors, Charles presumed, along with the mayor and 2 city council members. "Good afternoon and thank you for your patience," Barratt began, his voice carrying easily through the sound system. "Today marks an exciting milestone for Millfield's future. After extensive negotiation and due diligence, I'm pleased to announce that Barratt Development has reached an agreement in principle to acquire the Madison Tower and adjacent properties for our Millfield Renaissance project." A smattering of applause followed, primarily from the front rows where Barratt's supporters sat. Charles remained still, watching carefully. This $45 million investment will transform downtown, creating over 200 jobs and generating an estimated $3 million annually in tax revenue, Barratt continued. "We've worked closely with city officials to ensure this development honors Millfield's character while bringing much-needed economic vitality." The mayor stepped forward, shaking Barratt's hand for the cameras. "This is exactly the kind of forward-thinking investment Millfield needs," he declared. "We're excited to partner with Barratt Development to make this vision a reality." Barratt returned to the microphone. "We expect to finalize the purchase within days and begin preparation for construction next month. I'd be happy to take a few questions." Reporters raised hands, and Barratt called on a young woman in the front row. "Will the project include any affordable housing components, as mentioned in your initial proposal to the Planning Commission?" Barratt's smile never wavered. "We're still finalizing those details. Market conditions will ultimately determine the exact mix of units, but we remain committed to a development that serves the entire community." Charles recognized the evasion from his research, the first step in what would likely become a gradual elimination of any affordability commitments. He raised his hand, surprising himself with his boldness. Barratt's gaze passed over him initially, but with no other hands raised, he reluctantly nodded. "Yes, Mr. Winthrop?" Charles stood, aware of every eye turning toward him. "Mr. Barratt, you've announced an agreement in principle, but not a completed purchase. Given that I submitted a competing offer, I'm curious which property owners have accepted your proposal." A flash of annoyance crossed Barratt's face. "While I respect your interest, Mr. Winthrop, the details of private business transactions aren't typically discussed in press conferences. Suffice to say, we have commitments from the necessary parties." "Interesting," Charles replied, remaining standing, "because as of 10 a.m. today, I personally spoke with Mrs. Eleanor Williams, who owns the largest of the 4 properties, and she indicated no decision had been made. A murmur rippled through the audience. One of the men standing behind Barrett leaned forward, whispering something in his ear. Barrett's smile tightened. "Real estate transactions are complex, Mr. Winthrop. Perhaps there was a miscommunication. Now, if there are other questions about the development itself, I have one more question," Charles continued, his voice gaining strength. "In your previous developments in Charlotte, Augusta, and Nashville, affordable housing components were prominently featured in initial proposals, but disappeared from final plans. Will you commit today, publicly, that the Millfield Renaissance project will include at least 20% affordable units, as originally presented to the Planning Commission?" The room grew quiet. Barrett's expression hardened, his public persona cracking slightly. "Each development has unique economic constraints. We always strive to balance community benefits with financial viability. I won't make arbitrary commitments that might prove unrealistic as the project evolves." A reporter near the front stood up. "Mr. Barrett, can you respond directly to Mr. Winthrop's implication that your company has a pattern of promising community benefits to secure approvals, then eliminating those benefits later?" Barrett's practiced charm reasserted itself. "I reject the premise entirely. Barrett Development has a stellar record of community investment. Mr. Winthrop's characterization is both inaccurate and, frankly, appears motivated by his disappointment at losing out on a business opportunity." Charles felt a flicker of doubt. He was one man challenging a powerful corporation, easily dismissed as bitter or obstructionist. But then he remembered his father teaching adults who had been deliberately denied education, remembered the dignity in their faces as they claimed knowledge that others had tried to keep from them. That memory steadied him. "I have one final comment," Charles said, opening his portfolio. "Today I submitted a revised offer for these properties. Unlike Mr. Barrett's, mine is fully funded and includes legally binding commitments for historical preservation and affordable housing that cannot be modified after approval." He removed a document, holding it up. "I've also submitted this analysis to the City Council, documenting Barrett Development's pattern of modified projects in other cities, along with the overlapping relationships between Barrett and members of Millfield's various approval boards, relationships that create at minimum the appearance of conflicts of interest." The room erupted in conversation. Barrett's face darkened as he leaned toward the microphone. "This is outrageous. Mr. Winthrop is making baseless accusations to disrupt a legitimate business transaction. We'll be reviewing our legal options regarding these defamatory statements." Before Charles could respond, the doors at the back of the ballroom opened. A woman in a crisp suit entered, her expression serious. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice cutting through the noise. "I'm Catherine Myers from the State Historical Preservation Office. I need to make an announcement regarding the Madison Tower property." Barrett seemed momentarily frozen, then gestured toward the podium with forced graciousness. "By all means." Myers walked briskly to the front, nodding to Charles as she passed. At the podium, she adjusted the microphone. "After thorough review of structural elements and extensive documentary evidence, our office has granted preliminary historical designation to the Madison Tower, specifically recognizing its significant role in providing educational opportunities to the Black community during segregation." She continued over the growing murmurs. "This designation, effective immediately, requires state review of any substantial modifications to the building's exterior or structural elements. Additionally, a public hearing will be scheduled to consider permanent designation status." The implications were clear to everyone in the room. Barrett's plans for dramatic renovation would now face additional regulatory hurdles and public scrutiny. The mayor's face had lost its celebratory expression, and the investors behind Barrett were engaged in urgent, whispered conversation. Charles felt a complex emotion wash over him, not triumph exactly, but vindication. The history his father had helped create would not be erased so easily. As he gathered his documents, a reporter approached. "Mr. Winthrop, can you tell us more about your alternative proposal for these properties?" He nodded, finding his voice. "Winthrop Community Development Corporation has submitted an offer that preserves the Madison Tower as a community education center, while developing the adjacent properties as mixed-income housing and small business incubation spaces. Our proposal honors both Millfield's history and its future, As the press conference dissolved into competing questions and hastily arranged side conversations, Sophia appeared at Charles's side. "That was unexpected," she said, barely containing her excitement. "But we're not done yet. Barrett won't give up easily." "No," Charles agreed, watching Barrett huddled with his investors, their body language expressing clear distress. "But neither will we. We all face moments when standing our ground seems impossible against powerful opposition. If you've appreciated this story of perseverance against the odds, please take a moment to subscribe. It helps ensure these narratives of courage and dignity continue to reach others who need them." The following week passed in a blur of meetings, phone calls, and legal consultations. The historical designation had created a crucial pause in Barrett's momentum, but the ultimate outcome remained uncertain. Charles divided his time between courting property owners, refining his development proposal, and meeting with community members to build support. Each evening, exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him. At 73, the pace was punishing, his body protesting with aches and fatigue that he masked during daylight hours. Alone in his hotel room, he sometimes questioned whether the fight was worth the toll it was taking. On Wednesday afternoon, Charles sat at the daily grind, reviewing financial projections, when a shadow fell across his table. He looked up to find Richard Barrett standing there, his usual entourage nowhere in sight. "Mr. Winthrop," Barrett said, his tone carefully neutral. "May I join you?" Charles gestured to the empty chair, curiosity overcoming his instinctive wariness. Barrett sat, declining the waitress's offer of coffee with a brief shake of his head. "I'll be direct," Barrett said once they were alone. "You've created significant complications for my project. The historical designation, the publicity around potential conflicts of interest, the competing offer. It's become a distraction my investors find concerning." Charles said nothing, waiting for Barrett to continue. "I'm prepared to offer you a position as a community liaison for the Millfield Renaissance project," Barrett said, leaning forward slightly, "with a generous consulting fee. Your knowledge of local history would be valuable in shaping how we honor the legacy of the Madison Tower within our development." The offer hung in the air between them, not a bribe, not explicitly, but a clear attempt to neutralize opposition by absorption. Charles studied Barrett's face, seeing not the cartoon villain he'd sometimes imagined, but a businessman facing an unexpected obstacle, applying the tools that had always worked for him before. "That's a generous offer," Charles replied carefully. "But I don't think our visions for these properties are compatible, Mr. Barrett." Barrett's practiced patience showed its first crack. "What exactly do you want, Mr. Winthrop? If it's recognition for your father's work, we could name a wing of the hotel after him. If it's community investment, we can discuss specific commitments." "What I want," Charles said quietly, "is for the purpose of that building to be honored, not just its name. For the people who were excluded from opportunity to find open doors rather than decorative plaques. For history to be lived, not just memorialized." Barrett sighed, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "Noble sentiments, but economically unrealistic. Community centers don't generate the revenue needed to sustain historic properties. My project will create jobs, tax revenue, economic growth." "For whom?" Charles asked simply. Barrett stood, straightening his jacket. "I tried to find middle ground, Mr. Winthrop. Remember that when this gets more difficult." He placed a business card on the table. "My offer remains open until Friday. After that, we proceed as adversaries rather than potential partners." After Barrett left, Charles remained at the table, turning the business card over in his fingers. The offer represented the easiest path forward, a way to claim some victory while avoiding the risk of total defeat. His father might have understood such a compromise, might even have encouraged it. Take what you can get in a world that rarely offers fair terms. As twilight settled over Millfield, Charles walked slowly past the Madison Tower, its windows reflecting the golden light of sunset. He stopped, looking up at the place where his education had truly begun, not in formal classrooms, but watching his father teach adults who worked full days in fields and factories, then came to learn with minds still hungry despite bodies exhausted. What would those students think of Barrett's offer to name a wing of a luxury hotel after their teacher? Would they find it sufficient recognition of their struggle? Or would they see it as the final erasure of their story, reduced to a decorative plaque that hotel guests would pass without reading, their history rendered as mere architectural interest? Charles turned away, his decision made. Some compromises cost more than defeat. Friday morning dawned with dark clouds gathering on the horizon, the promise of autumn rain hanging in the humid air. Charles arrived at his attorney's office for what had become a daily strategy meeting, only to find Bradley Ellis in conversation with Eleanor Williams, owner of the largest property in the proposed development area. "Mrs. Williams," Charles said, surprised. "I didn't realize you'd be joining us." Eleanor Williams was 81, a former school principal whose family had owned significant portions of downtown Millfield for generations. Her property, which included the land beneath the Madison Tower, represented the keystone of any development plan. "I asked Mr. Ellis to arrange this meeting," she said, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to managing unruly classrooms. "It seems I've become the deciding vote in this situation." Ellis gestured for them to sit. "Mrs. Williams has received final offers from both Barrett Development and your corporation, Mr. Winthrop. She wanted to discuss them with you directly before making her decision." Eleanor studied Charles with sharp eyes that belied her age. "I remember your father, you know. William Winthrop taught my younger brother to read when the public school had written him off as slow. Turned out he just needed someone who believed he could learn." Charles felt a tightness in his throat. He believed everyone deserved that chance. "Indeed." Eleanor placed 2 folders on the desk. "Barrett Development has offered me $12 million for my property, nearly 30% above its appraised value. Your offer is $10 million, which is still more than fair." She regarded Charles steadily. "But this isn't just about money for me. That building has meant something to this community, something that money doesn't easily measure." "I understand," Charles said quietly. "Barrett has also promised to name their grand ballroom after my late husband," Eleanor continued. "Quite the honor, they assured me. The James Williams Ballroom in the Madison Grand Hotel." Charles nodded, knowing that such gestures often swayed property owners, particularly those of an age to be considering their legacies. "Your proposal is different," Eleanor said, opening the second folder. "You're offering less money but a 51% ownership stake for my family in the Community Development Corporation that would manage the property, meaning we would remain connected to decisions about its future." "That's correct," Charles confirmed. "Your family would have a permanent voice in how these properties evolve and serve the community." Eleanor closed both folders. "When I was a young teacher in the 1960s, I brought my students to programs at the Community Education Center. I watched children who were struggling in traditional classrooms come alive when they discovered the lending library, the art programs, the elders who volunteered as tutors. That building saved futures before they could be lost." She stood, straightening her dress with dignity. "Mr. Winthrop, I've decided to accept your offer on one condition, that you name the Restored Education Center not after my husband or your father, but after the community itself. Let it be the People's Building, as it was always meant to be." Charles rose, extending his hand. "I would be honored to accept that condition, Mrs. Williams." As they shook hands, Ellis looked between them, professional neutrality barely concealing his surprise. "I'll draw up the paperwork immediately. Barrett Development will need to be notified." "I'll handle that personally," Eleanor said, with the faintest trace of satisfaction. "Mr. Barrett has been quite persistent in his communications. I believe I owe him the courtesy of a direct response." By late afternoon, word had spread throughout Millfield that Eleanor Williams had accepted Winthrop Community Development Corporation's offer for her property. The other 3 property owners, who had been waiting on Eleanor's decision, quickly followed suit. By evening, local news was reporting that the controversial downtown development had taken an unexpected turn. The rain that had threatened all day finally arrived as Charles walked back to his hotel, feeling lighter despite the weather. Droplets drummed against his umbrella, washing away dust from the brick buildings and creating miniature rivers along the curbs. The cleansing felt symbolic somehow, a fresh start after weeks of tension and uncertainty. His phone rang, Sophia calling with news. "The mayor has requested a meeting with you tomorrow," she said, excitement evident in her voice. "Apparently there's interest in discussing how the city might support the community center restoration through matching grants." Charles smiled. "Amazing how quickly priorities shift when momentum changes." "That's politics," Sophia agreed. "But there's more. Barrett Development has withdrawn their Renaissance project proposal entirely. Their investors apparently lost confidence after the historical designation and property acquisition fell through." As Charles hung up, a complex emotion washed over him. Not triumph over Barrett, but gratitude for the chance to fulfill a promise made long ago. The fight had been necessary, but it wasn't the victory that mattered most. It was what would happen next, the restoration of purpose to a place that had once changed so many lives, including his own. Has a building or place ever held special meaning in your life? A place that shaped who you became or represented something important to your community? I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. 2 weeks later, Charles stood on a makeshift stage erected in front of the Madison Tower. Around him gathered a crowd of Millfield residents, some elderly citizens who remembered the building's original purpose, others younger folks who had only known it as an anonymous office building. Media cameras captured the moment as Charles approached the microphone. 58 years ago, he began, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd. I sat in the back of a classroom on the second floor of this building, watching my father teach grown men and women to read. These were people who had been deliberately denied education, who worked full days in fields and factories, yet still found the energy to come here evenings to claim knowledge others had tried to keep from them. Charles gestured to the building behind him. Within these walls, a quiet revolution took place, not with speeches or protests, but with the patient turning of pages, the careful forming of letters, the dignity of minds awakening to their own power. That revolution changed lives. It certainly changed mine. The autumn breeze carried the scent of fallen leaves and possibility as Charles continued. Today, we begin the work of restoring not just a building, but a purpose. The Millfield Community Education and Resource Center will once again be a place where doors open rather than close, where opportunity is extended rather than withheld, where history lives rather than being merely remembered. He unfolded a large blueprint, holding it up for the crowd to see. This renovation will preserve the historical elements of the building while creating modern spaces for education, entrepreneurship, and community gathering. The adjacent properties will become affordable housing and small business incubation spaces, owned in partnership with families who have historic ties to this neighborhood. Eleanor Williams joined him at the microphone, her presence adding weight to the moment. This project represents the best of Millfield, honoring our past while building our future. It reminds us that progress isn't just about new construction, but about preserving the values and purposes that make a community worth belonging to. After the ceremony, as volunteers served refreshments and community members examined the displayed renovation plans, Richard Barrett approached Charles. His usual entourage was absent, his expression thoughtful rather than challenging. Quite a different vision than what I had planned, Barrett observed, hands in his pockets. Charles nodded. Different priorities lead to different outcomes. My investors were disappointed, Barrett continued. They saw only financial loss. But I've been thinking about what you said, about who benefits from development. Charles studied the younger man, noting a hesitancy that hadn't been present before. And I'm wondering if there might be a middle path. Barrett gestured toward the adjacent property. My company still has investment capital allocated for Millfield. What if we discussed a modified development on the North Block? Mixed income housing, retail spaces reserved for local businesses, design elements that complement rather than overshadow the historical district. Charles raised an eyebrow, skeptical but interested. That would be quite a departure from your usual projects. Maybe it's time for some new approaches, Barrett replied. Not out of altruism, let's be clear. I still need to generate returns for my investors. But perhaps there's a model that serves multiple interests without sacrificing either profit or community benefit. I'd be open to that conversation, Charles said carefully, with appropriate legal guarantees that community commitments remain binding throughout development. Barrett nodded, the hint of a genuine smile replacing his usual practiced charm. I'll have my team draft a preliminary proposal. And Mr. Winthrop, I may have underestimated you. It won't happen again. As Barrett walked away, Sophia approached, handing Charles a glass of lemonade. Was that a peace offering from the enemy? Charles sipped the cool drink, considering. Perhaps the beginning of one, or perhaps just a strategic repositioning. Either way, it's a conversation worth having. Sophia glanced around at the diverse crowd mingling in front of the Madison Tower. Elderly residents sharing stories with young families, local business owners discussing possibilities with community organizers. You've started something here that's bigger than just saving a building. No, Charles corrected gently. I've continued something my father started, that others carried forward before me, that you and others will carry after me. That's how community works, not in isolated victories, but in continuous cultivation across generations. Standing there, surrounded by the gathering dusk and the people of his hometown, Charles felt a sense of completion that transcended the legal documents signed or battles won. He had returned to the place where his journey began and found not just memories, but purpose, the chance to ensure that doors once closed would remain permanently open for those who would come after. If this story of perseverance and community legacy has touched you, please consider subscribing to our channel. Each subscription helps us continue sharing stories that honor the dignity of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. 6 months later, the Madison Tower stood transformed yet familiar, its red brick facade cleaned and restored to its original luster. New windows filled the historical openings, energy-efficient replicas of the originals. The worn steps leading to the main entrance had been repaired rather than replaced, preserving the subtle indentations left by generations of footsteps. Inside, the building hummed with activity. The main floor housed a community library and digital resource center, where teenagers helped senior citizens navigate computer basics while children browsed books in a colorful reading nook. The second floor contained classroom spaces where evening GED courses were already filled to capacity, along with financial literacy workshops and small business planning seminars. Charles stood in what had once been his father's classroom, now modernized but intentionally preserved with the original chalkboard and several restored student desks. Photographs lined the walls, images from the building's history, faces of teachers and students spanning decades of community education. "It came together beautifully," said Eleanor Williams, joining him at the window that overlooked the courtyard. Below, workers were completing the community garden where neighborhood families had already claimed plots for spring planting. "It did," Charles agreed, "though we're still fundraising for the technology lab expansion." Eleanor smiled. "The mayor called this morning. The city council approved the matching grant program. Whatever we raise in private donations, they'll match up to $500,000. Charles raised an eyebrow. "The same council that was so firmly in Barrett's corner 6 months ago." "Amazing how winning elections requires listening to voters," Eleanor replied with a knowing smile. After the historical designation controversy made the national news, suddenly everyone wanted to be on the right side of preservation. In the adjacent lot, construction had begun on the mixed-income housing development, a joint venture between Winthrop Community Development Corporation and a modified version of Barrett's original plan. The compromise design maintained historical scale and character while providing both affordable and market-rate units. Most importantly, legally binding covenants ensured the affordability requirements could not be modified after approval, a precedent that had already influenced 2 other developments in the region. As the afternoon light slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the classroom floor, a group of middle school students arrived for their after-school mentoring program. They entered with the controlled energy of youth, curious about the 2 elderly people standing by the window. "Mr. Winthrop, Mrs. Williams," their teacher called out, "would you mind telling the students about what this building used to be? They're working on an oral history project about Millfield." Charles exchanged glances with Eleanor, both recognizing the invitation for what it was. Not just a history lesson, but the passing of witness from one generation to the next. The continuation of memory, the preservation of purpose. "We'd be honored," Charles replied, turning toward the curious young faces. "It begins with understanding that buildings aren't just structures of brick and wood, but containers for human possibility. This particular building has a story that starts long before any of us were born, in a time when opportunities weren't equally shared." As he spoke, Charles felt the presence of his father beside him, the circle of time bending back on itself. He had left Millfield as a young man seeking opportunity elsewhere, only to return decades later to ensure that opportunity remained available to those who stayed. The symmetry felt right somehow. A debt repaid, a promise kept, a legacy not just preserved, but renewed. Outside, the first tentative green buds of spring appeared on the old oak trees lining Center Street, their branches reaching toward a future they would not themselves see. Like all who plant seeds intended for shade they will never sit beneath, Charles had come to understand that the true measure of a life isn't what you accumulate, but what you make possible for others. And that, perhaps, was the most valuable inheritance of all. not wealth or property, but the dignity of creating space for potential to flourish, for history to breathe, for community to renew itself through the continuous work of remembering and becoming. If you've stayed with this story until the end, you're someone who understands the power of perseverance and dignity. Please click on the video appearing on your screen now for an even more incredible story of triumph against impossible odds, one that will leave you both inspired and empowered to make a difference in your own community.